Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. Thanks for being with me this Tuesday at 1 o'clock Pacific, like every Tuesday. So when we think about the potentially incredible statistics that the plant-based innovation and alternatives protein sector has to share with the world about how much better it is or less intense it is, let's say, with natural resources, animal welfare, human health, curtailing pandemics, less methane emissions, so many positive statistics coming from the sector. But to get those positive statistics, you have to have more than just we believe. It's our idea. We have to have some kind of framework that helps us analyze all stages of the business, not just the end stage, but all the way up the supply chain to see exactly how much impact we do have on the sector. So as the world starts to focus on carbon footprint, and you see even brands like Oatly starting to measure their carbon footprint and compare it to regular milk, I'll say, industry milk, so cow's milk, and you see that difference that an oat milk brings compared to a cow's milk. More and more brands are going to want to do this. And to do this, you really need to start analyzing your entire supply chain. Who can talk about this better than the very fabulous Sharyn Murray, who joins me today? She's the Investment Engagement Manager at the Good Food Institute, GFI, as most people know it. Thanks for being with me today, Sharyn.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Elizabeth.
So I will say that you have not acted alone. The framework that you've put together, this ESG framework, helping plant-based innovation and alternative proteins businesses analyze their supply chains to see what kind of impact they have and what kind of numbers they can report. You've done this with FAIR, better known as perhaps the Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return Initiative. Perhaps you can tell me about GFI, maybe explain what FAIR is to people, or I can, and then why you two are working together and what you have accomplished of late.
Absolutely. Yes, this was very much a team effort and it was a big undertaking. So we were very grateful to work with FAIR on this. So I suspect that many in your audience know GFI, but briefly for those who might not, we are an international nonprofit that is reimagining meat production. You can think of us as a global think tank. We work across areas of policy, science and technology, and corporate engagement. That's where this investor work sits, all to create a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We're lucky enough to be fully funded by individuals and foundations, so that lets us do all of our work at no cost and offer all of our resources in an open access format, including, of course, the one we're discussing today. And then, yes, happy to take a crack at describing FAIR as well. So FAIR is a network of more than 350 investors. They represent something like $70 trillion in combined assets, which is a difficult number to imagine. Mm-hmm. And they provide research, tools, and collective engagement opportunities for the investors in their network. So they work with their investors to push companies on issues ranging from working conditions in meat packing to working with the large global food companies to diversify their protein sources to include alternative proteins, which of course is in overlap with GFI's work. You could think of them as a shop to help investors integrate ESG risks and opportunities into their investment decision-making with respect to food and particular protein. And then in terms of why we've worked together, it's a good question because we haven't done something quite like this before, but perhaps just from my description of the two organizations, it's perhaps a little more clear why we work together on ESG frameworks for the alternative protein industry. So GFI, of course, brings all protein expertise. FAIR brings the ESG expertise, although we both have expertise in the other area. Another synergy to note is that GFI primarily works with private market investors, as that's where most of our industry is today. Mm-hmm. And then FAIR primarily works with public market investors, although again, there really is overlap, so these are not clear lines.
Mm-hmm. If I can just pop in there and give my sort of layman's perspective, if you will, I go to GFI, and that's gfi.org, everybody, so hit them up. I go there for industry knowledge, lots of state of the industry reports. If I need statistics on how much has been invested in alternative proteins in a particular year or one decade versus another decade, I look at how many venture capital, so not public companies, but private companies, investment deals took place, or the growth of the sector in terms of sales and just the state internationally, maybe GFI Israel, GFI Brazil, GFI India. So from a global perspective, any of these statistics and information on the sector, I always go to gfi.org. And then FAIR, I don't have it scrolling here below, but it's FAIRR.org, Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return. So grateful for this organization, which helps investors, hence the 70 trillion, if not more. And I interviewed Jeremy Collar, who's the founder of FAIR, just about 14 months ago. And at that point, it was something like 46 trillion. So we're looking at that kind of growth. That is indicative of the work that he and FAIR are doing to help this public sector investment community understand the risks and opportunities, but also risks of investing in meat companies. We won't get into it too much today, but we will touch on the fringe of some of that investing, pandemic risk and human health risk, the rising cost of healthcare, methane emissions, all these risks to investing in that industry, which is showing so many signs of cracking. That research is done by FAIR and makes it also free and public. So FAIRR.org. That's kind of a layman's perspective to Sharyn's excellent descriptions. Okay, but you are working together now, and you're working together on something very specific, these ESG frameworks to help primarily alternative protein businesses, so private businesses, correct?
Almost. So that is the case for one of the frameworks. That's our specialized framework. And maybe even just to take a quick step back and define what we mean by frameworks, it can mean quite a few things to different people. So these can be thought of as industry-specific ESG reporting guidelines. And these are for companies that manufacture or sell alternative proteins. So certainly for these private or even public companies like a Beyond Meat or an Oatly that you mentioned, who specialize in alternative proteins. That's our specialized framework. And then we've got our diversified framework. These are for large companies, so CPG companies, meat companies, who produce alternative proteins as part of a broader business. So a Unilever or a Danone, a Conagra, a Frig. And actually, the four companies that I just noted all contributed their insights to this framework. So this was a FAIR and GFI effort, but very much so an industry-wide effort to make sure that these were really meeting everyone's needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's wonderful because what that tells me is that these companies that are currently, from a majority standpoint, producing meat, they have plant-based and alternative proteins, but they're primarily still focused their core business on meat. They're seeing themselves the ESG benefit of switching over to plant-based businesses, at least one channel of business. And I'd love to get your perspective perhaps at the end about what you think these businesses will do by, let's say, 2025, how much of their core business will shift from meat to plant-based. But we'll get to those kind of predictions at the end. So, okay, so we have these two frameworks, one for the private sector, smaller business, we'll say, and then one for these larger, potentially public companies, maple leaf type companies of the world that have both meat and plant-based. So I would think these larger companies would already be disclosing, no, and not looking at and not needing this kind of help. But if we could, as you say, take a step back. So frameworks, we've defined what that is. Why do we need to look at our supply chains and figure out the impact?
Yeah, so good questions all around. So first of all, on that good one on why these large companies might need this. We're very much aware that these large companies are already reporting ESG to their investors, publishing sustainability reports. You might see these on their websites. For that reason, the diversified framework is actually much more limited. It's a supplementary framework to their ESG reporting. So it really zeroes in on the alt protein part of their business and how that contributes to their overall ESG goals. Meanwhile, for the specialized companies, so primarily private companies, a few public, that are specialists in all proteins, this is meant to be a holistic kind of one-stop shop for them. Mm-hmm. And the reason we need this is, look, we know, likely in this audience, I hope, globally, there's increased recognition that alternative proteins can be a key solution for the many emergencies the globe is facing, right? Climate change, biodiversity, public health, food security emergencies. and that has contributed to investments flowing into this industry.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, we also know the amount is really minuscule compared to what we've seen for things like renewable energy. I've heard you talk about this a lot. And just nowhere near where it needs to be to enable this rapid, large-scale transition.
Mm-hmm.
ESG considerations are increasingly important to investment decision-making, and investors are really increasing their demand for a standardized industry-specific way to measure ESG risks. This exists for many industries. So listeners might be aware of, for example, a SASB, which is now integrated into IFRS and ISSB. We're starting with a lot of acronyms here, so apologies for that. These exist for many industries, but alternative proteins is relatively new, and that just has not been created yet. This was leading to many companies and investors trying to figure this ESG monitoring and reporting out on their own, which of course is not ideal, both from a resourcing perspective for the industry, right? GFI loves to step in and try to do these things that lift up the entire industry. And also things aren't going to be comparable. If everybody's figuring out different ways of reporting, they might not align with ESG reporting best practices. Not everyone is an expert in this space. And so because both FAIR and GFI were seeing these challenges in our stakeholder engagement, we really wanted to step in, meet the needs for the industry, and hopefully increase investment in the industry by helping investors see the really strong ESG characteristics of alternative proteins.
Mm-hmm. Could you go back and give us the definition of some of those acronyms so that people know what we're talking about?
Yes. So I will say I might not be able to say what all of them stand for, but all the acronyms I mentioned, so SASB. ISSB, which is International Sustainability Standards Boards, I think.
Yes.
They are, thank you. They are examples of voluntary framework providers. So they are NGOs or industry groups. There are others we can add in here, GRI being another one, some may have heard of, that came together to provide guidance to companies on how to report on the ESG characteristics of their companies. And maybe we should define ESG actually.
I was just going to say, let's actually define ESG.
Yes. So it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And these are non-financial factors that impact companies' financials and performance. You might know, your listeners might know that, in the US, for example, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, try to avoid acronyms here, mandate financial reporting by public companies, right? There's very strict guidance on how companies report their financials. But this doesn't yet exist for reporting on non-financial considerations that nonetheless are very important to a company's bottom line, and certainly a double bottom line as investors increasingly care about things beyond just the financial return. And so these voluntary standards have come into being to help meet this gap. Now, luckily, we are seeing, especially in Europe, even a little in the US, some potentially regulatorily mandated guidance coming on board in these areas. It's not there yet. And so for now, these kind of voluntary standards have helped create a single, or in this case, several different languages on ESG because there's so many of them, but ISSB is working to bring that together into a single global standard.
Mm-hmm. And how much, if any, have you worked with ISB or SASB?
So we, one and the same today, and SASB was one of the groups that we connected with to provide us with feedback on the frameworks.
That's great.
And in our frameworks themselves, so in the specialized one in particular, we tried to have a high overlap with these common voluntary frameworks that companies are already reporting to and that investors are comfortable with, so that we didn't create a whole new thing that then everybody had to worry about. We tried to pick and choose kind of the best of what was out there, and then add where we felt that perhaps some areas weren't yet focused on adequately that were really important for alternative proteins.
Mm-hmm. And when did these frameworks come out?
Last September, so just about a couple months out now.
Okay, but you haven't promoted them too much, and I'm wondering, it's maybe still in beta in terms of getting the word out, but that's what this program is about as well. What has the reception been like to the frameworks for, let's say, the smaller plant-based innovation companies?
Yeah, so we did do some amount of a push to get them out. Back in September, we hosted a webinar and we went out to several media channels. We had over, I think, 1,200 downloads actually of the framework within the first month, including by many leading companies. So both the private companies, but also large public companies and investors. But of course, it goes further than just getting these in the hands of those companies. We also want to support adoption, because tools like this are only as useful as they are being used broadly. And so certainly efforts like this to get the word out are part of that effort. We've also, both FAIR and GFI, have been meeting with companies and investors to help them think through how to integrate these frameworks into their process. And what we're seeing, the way that they're doing this really varies widely. So for companies who are younger, haven't really thought about this, perhaps for investors newer to alternative proteins, they're thinking about adopting these frameworks almost holistically, because they're starting from scratch, and
Right.
here's a tool they can use. And that was really the goal. For companies who are more advanced, so in Upfield, for example, who have excellent sustainability reporting already, they're looking at it to see what is additive to their reporting. So where can it enhance their reporting? And one area that companies like them have really liked are the more impact-oriented metrics. So ones that speak to the good that their companies and products are having on the environment and society, rather than simply some of the risks that they're mitigating, although that also is very important for investors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've always really loved about FAIR, is pointing out that risk and how that risk can impact your bottom line as an investor. And therefore, because there's been a lot of pushback on ESG in general as a concept, politically speaking, I'll say, this past year in 2022. And so there's been some the average individual investor, confusion about, is ESG really good for a bottom line? Is it that important? Is it meaningful, et cetera? And FAIR does a great job of explaining just how real and negatively impactful those risks are on your investments. And so this framework that you, GFI and FAIR, have done together, how do you see these businesses using it beyond reporting? So first of all, you can't change what you don't know. So first of all, I love that you said we're trying to get these companies to think about this, and that key word being think. So first you have to identify the value and what you're doing, and then you can execute the questions, research, reporting, discovery reporting, et cetera. So beyond just creating a report, how do you expect these companies to use this information once they have it?
Yeah, great question. So there are a few ways, and it really differs by the type of company. So for really early stage companies, or even for companies that have been around for a few years, that's still early stage in the development of the
Yes.
goals and the businesses they're aiming to create. We really hope this can serve as a roadmap for the best ESG practices. So the way to set up their businesses, their operations in ways that really meet that sustainable, ethical business that they all set out to create.
Mm-hmm.
And also help them set up operations and data management that lets them report this data both to investors and to other stakeholders who are increasingly going to be demanding this of them, including regulators.
Mm-hmm.
For some of these large CPG and meat companies, we know that there are internal stakeholders who really believe in the power of alternative proteins and their potential, but they have to convince their internal stakeholders. And so the diversified framework can be a great tool for them to help those internal decision makers to see how alternative proteins can help them effectively meet their corporate social responsibility and ESG goals. And then the last thing I'll note is this tool is primarily for investors, right? The level of detail that's asked does not, companies would not want to publish this whole thing on their website. They would maybe go up against some antitrust law constraints. But for a subset of these disclosures, they are also a great way to communicate their ESG benefits, their sustainability benefits, to the global public audience. So to their consumers, of course, to the media, to governments and other stakeholders that care about this increasingly. And again, want to really understand like the specifics of these benefits, not just hear big platitudes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you say that. We sort of, the royal we come from the sector, and therefore we consider it a fait accompli that we have wonderful environmental stats. But not everyone believes that. You have to back that up with proof, particularly when you're looking at internal stakeholders and, let's say, a meat company that's looking to shift its business channels to be more plant-based. To get that kind of major large-scale investment, much larger than a smaller private company, you're going to need to show me the money. And that's what this does. It allows for the thinking to take place, the research, the setting up the structure, to look at the data and then analyze it and then have those statistics internally, but then externally as well. I think this is going to actually end up working to inform marketing campaigns. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I can certainly see that. And I think you made a great point on some of this misunderstanding or pushback. And that's not specific to alternative proteins, right? We've
Correct.
seen all of this kind of complaint about greenwashing, companies setting targets, blowing past them. And so, some of the types of disclosures that we recommend companies speak to actually provide evidence for the impact. So, for example, we might ask, does your company actually measure the amount of land use avoided through the sale of alternative proteins compared to the animal derived products? And if so, what is that reduction in the current year? So not just what is your target? We ask for targets too, because of course targets are the first step in achieving these goals, but we ask for the actual results. And then similarly for economic benefits. So how many jobs has your company created? Has your company undertaken or funded any direct economic development projects to facilitate a just transition? Because we know, especially for farmers and for other workers in our society, any transition is not easy, and we think companies have a role to play in that. So again, you're showing, not just telling.
And I love this because when we think of positive stats, we usually think of methane or, let's say, water use, but that job creation statistic, I'd like to know that actually, which is going to lead me to my next question. Is GFI doing anything with these results for the sector as a whole? Are you leaving this to each individual company to decide if they're going to disclose them to you or not, or what might we see coming out of this, if anything, for the sector?
Yeah, it's one of our top questions that we get, so I appreciate you asking it. So no, we're not collecting data from these frameworks at this time. This is really meant for a tool for the industry. FAIR does publish ESG indexes, as we discussed, and so they might use some of these disclosures as inputs into these indices in the future. But on GFI side, it's not something we're planning. It's just not a role we play in the industry. But we do want to do a few things to help bring this to light. So we do hope to publish several case studies on how companies are using the frameworks and some of the benefits they're seeing, some of their actual data. So we'll give some examples to help bring this to life. And we also want to facilitate companies and investors speaking together. So perhaps some roundtables that we can host to help companies talk through how to actually implement this and how to improve their businesses. So one topic could be something like how to get this data from your suppliers. You mentioned methane, greenhouse gas emissions. That's not something companies can measure directly, right? It's throughout their supply chain. So that's an important piece of that.
Yeah. And have you had any pushback from companies saying, I just am not going to be able to get scope 3? So what we mean by that, again, people, is scope 1, 2, and 3 all the way up the supply chain, usually scope 3 at the very beginning of the supply chain. So you're relying on other people to give you data. Some people just might not have access. Is that a hurdle?
Yeah, so this is certainly a challenge across all ESG reporting. What we did with this framework, though, for the specialized one, is we adjusted it to try to meet companies' abilities and capabilities to report. So we did this by manufacturing stage, which is actually based on feedback that we received that this was the most effective way to segment companies. So lab stage companies, really early stage, they're not reporting at all. They have access, they can view this as a roadmap, but nothing is expected of them. For demo and for pilot stage companies, about a fourth of the disclosures are expected. And these really don't go across the supply chain. So on those scopes, they're just asked for scope 1. They're asked for things that are entirely in their control, policy-based types of disclosures. Once we get to commercial stage, industrial stage, so these larger, more advanced companies, then more is expected of them, including scope 3 emissions. We know this will take time, so we also recommend about 2 years for adoption of the framework, including if you switch. So if you switch from pilot stage to commercial stage, or I guess from demo stage to commercial stage, you have 2 years to then meet this kind of further level of reporting. And then we have a subset of advanced metrics. So these are even ones we recognize that for commercial stage companies, this might be really hard to meet even in those 2 years. So these are more aspirational and reporting over time. So yes, this is hard, but it also is critical, especially given, again, the crises we're facing, how little time we have to start addressing these. And so we try to meet the balance of doing what is necessary, but also understanding where companies are at today and giving them time and recognizing, their personnel and the cost profiles that they're working under.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question. Let's say you're a small private company and you would like to start implementing these frameworks so that you can better understand for yourself as well as for the outside world your impact on environment, social, and government principles and how that impacts the bottom line for the investor as well. How expensive is it? How difficult is it to execute? Like, what are, tactically speaking, just how hard is it to undertake one of these frameworks?
So it depends on where you are, right? What's expected of you based on your size.
Yeah.
And then it depends on your internal resourcing, your data, and the systems that you have set up. So the hope is that these companies that start really early take a look at these frameworks and set themselves up for success 3, 4, 5 years down the line when they hit kind of each of these milestones. If you're starting, you haven't thought about this at all, you have nobody on staff, you have to hire probably someone on staff or some kind of consultant to support you in this. So there are going to be personnel costs. You might have to set up systems. You might have to consider and push your suppliers to provide some of this data. Now, we've talked to a few of the large ingredient companies, and they're very interested in partnering with the alternative protein producers to supply this data. So I think part of it's going to be on the companies themselves. Part of it is just the ecosystem that's being built up around ESG reporting, which again is not solely for alternative proteins. So to some extent, the more companies are focused on this, the easier and cheaper it's going to get. But that's not to say it comes with no cost. You do need someone on staff to manage this, perhaps several someones, or at least outsource some of that work.
It's probably potentially its own department or could grow into its own department. But I love what you say about the ingredient companies. I know I've spoken to Ingredion, which is very sustainability focused, and they are ready and willing. They are like ahead of the curve, and that they already have these numbers. They've been working with a company called How Good, and they are ready to distribute, ready to respond. And the reason is this might seem like a burden to some smaller companies, and they might think like, why do I really have to do this? Pressure is coming. So we are going through the global food systems transformation. And the reason that is because our current global food supply system is showing its stress cracks. It's susceptible to pandemics. It uses too much land and water. It emits too much emissions. It uses natural resources poorly and inefficiently, such that we're going to have trouble feeding a growing population. Can't feed people. You're talking about wars and political instability. It just grows from there. So to respond to that, you're seeing pressure from investors. You're seeing pressure, as Sharyn said, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, that wanting to focus on people's supply chain scopes 1, 2, and 3 to push them to enact better practices. This isn't really going to be optional, I don't believe, in, I'll say, short order by 2025. Would you like to venture anything there? Could you respond to its optionality versus necessity in the near future?
Yeah, so look, the SEC has a sustainability reporting draft out. They received a lot of comments on this, and we'll see what they do. I hesitate to predict the future with respect to U.S. regulation.
Yes.
In Europe, it seems a lot more certain. So there are various regulations with respect to funds. So funds have to meet certain requirements to call themselves ESG and impact funds. There's Article 8 and Article 9 concept. There's the green taxonomy, which industries fit into this. This is still all being developed, but it's certainly, some of it is already enacted and is continuing to be worked on. So that seems more certain. And this impacts multinational companies. So even if they have a US headquarter and they operate to a certain revenue requirement or revenues in Europe, they'll be impacted by this. The other point I want to make, though, so these are all really important, right? Companies are going to have to do this, and investors and others care, and it's important for our future. On the kind of carrot side of it, this can help companies reduce their cost of capital. So we've seen things like green bonds in Europe in particular, but globally. So these are bonds companies are raising for sustainability-oriented projects. That interest rate is lower than it would be otherwise. And so we can apply that concept to equity as well. Companies that can show these positive ESG characteristics are probably going to have more demand by investors, right? Because we have these impact ESG investors. They actually have a lot of capital to put to work. PitchBook has something out, I have to look at the precise number, but something over $100 billion that impact funds have to put to work as of last September when we published these frameworks. And so when you have more demand for your round, you're going to raise, either higher valuation, you're going to have more money you can raise. It's going to reduce that cost of capital. So we talked about the expense that companies need to expend to report on this data. But the hope is that they get a whole lot more back, even just from a financial perspective for doing so.
Right. And as well, from a marketing perspective, they're going to have those positive stats to show on front of pack, and they're going to be more competitive in that grocery store aisle. And that too is going to bring more capital. And that's going to bring more distribution possibilities, because when you as a product have better environmental, social, or governance statistics, well, then that grocery store wants to carry you because you make their numbers look better. Everyone is looking to make their numbers better. And so when you are out in front with good numbers, you are out in front, and there's so much equity to being first. So I'm so thrilled that FAIR and GFI are working together, have worked together to put these frameworks out there as tools so that plant-based innovation and alternative protein companies can start to gather that data and report their statistics. So I think it's going to be very meaningful for the sector as a whole. I wondered if you are already seeing some small companies put this into action. How quickly has it been adopted?
I wish I could say yes, and here are the companies. This all takes time. So we've had dozens of conversations. We have companies who have said we are committed to adopting this framework. But as I said, we've given 2 years for companies to do so. And so they have to gather their data. They have to consider how this fits into their existing reporting if they're ready reporting. So that's the stage that we're at. We're having these conversations. We would love to have more conversations. We're going to be doing proactive outreach. And certainly for any listeners of this show, you're welcome to reach out to me. You can drop my email perhaps in the show notes or somewhere else later, and I'll get you to the right colleague to help you think about how to implement this. So it's coming, but no very precise results to speak to yet.
So you can always find Sharyn Murray on LinkedIn. SHARYN. Everybody, Sharyn Murray on LinkedIn. And of course, I'll drop her email in show notes. Sharyn Murray, GFI, LinkedIn is going to work as well. So it takes a little bit of time, but I think there's a willingness. That's what I anecdotally see, is that there's a willingness to get out in front and wrap their minds around this so that they can report those positive statistics, because it does give a competitive advantage in the field. I'm going to try and go ahead and share my screen just to see if I can show visually. I'm sorry to everybody listening on audio podcast, coming from the GFI and FAIR Alternative Proteins ESG Reporting Technical Guide for Specialized Companies, just to show visually what the thinking is to start producing that data. So looking at strategy and your inputs and seeing what kind of outputs you have and what data comes from that, the outcomes, and then the end impact. We're not going to get into the technicalities of this today, but just to show you, it's as much structuring how you think about executing as that it is going ahead to execute this and then finally report. So great stuff. In case you need the website again, it is gfi.org/industry/ESG-reporting. Those on audio podcast, it's gfi.org/industry/ESG-reporting. So, and that will be in show notes for sure. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you who speaks to so many companies, public and private, large and small, meat and alternative proteins. Do you have any predictions for the sector? This is not about ESG reporting. This is just the sector as a whole. Any predictions for the sector? I used to say like 10 years out, but the world just shifts so quickly now. I'll say 5 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one which perhaps is quite timely given the market environment we're in is I really do believe that the industry is going to emerge from this market downturn stronger than ever before. Now, we might have fewer companies. That's just the nature of any industry's development. And of course, we feel for those companies. But those that get through will be healthier. And investors are also going to have more reasonable expectations for growth and for the value in the industry, which is going to serve those companies over the long term. They're going to have stronger partners from investors who really understand them and are in it for the long term, not the maybe 2 years it would take for a software company to build out its consumer base and grow.
Okay, so you're seeing, do you want to put a date to that? Like if we're coming out stronger, when do you think we'll kind of turn the corner?
So it's difficult because we've seen that macro conditions and market conditions influence this industry greatly in terms of the investment flows. So we just put out a blog post, a newsletter on this, but essentially our analysis shows that any downturn in private investments in alternative proteins really align very heavily with the downturn overall in private markets. And our surveys of investors show the same. Any slowdown in investment really was driven by macro and market concerns, not by concerns specific to alternative proteins. Of course, there's some of those for every industry, but this is not the primary driver. And so perhaps my prediction rather than a specific year is going to be that when the market turns around, we've seen interest rates and inflation in particular be the driver of this most recent downturn. Alternative proteins will emerge together with the market. So I think it's going to happen in concert.
Mm-hmm. I think all the more reason to spend your time in your office getting all that data, because that market turnaround is coming. I'm going to say 2024, but okay, it is coming, and you want to be ready. You want to be ready to get out those good stats and get that capital either through just revenue sales or through private investment. But I think not just alternative proteins are going to come out of this better. I think the average investor is going to come out more focused, more driven, and more educated and more ready. So there's a lot of pent-up energy I sense in the interviews that I do with Wall Street investors. And I feel that they're waiting for the signals, and they don't have them yet. But when they have them, it's going to be like, a kid who finally got out of school for summer. I think they're going to be running and screaming to invest, and they're going to go where they feel that the ESG is strongest, because they're investing for themselves, their next generation, and also you can see the stress cracks on the current food supply system. You can see that one system is on its way out. It's early days, and one system is on its way in, and who doesn't want to invest in a secular trend? So that's what I see. Okay. It has been a dicey, I think 2023 is going to be a little dicey. Certainly 2022 was tricky. Even the end of 2021 was tricky. So as you look back, I'll say now, looking backwards, the last 5 years, what do you wish you knew then that you know now?
Honestly, for me, I think it's as simple as that. 5 years ago, I wish I knew this industry existed, so I could have gotten involved sooner. I'm a relative newbie. I've been here for about 2.5 years and prior invested in hedge funds. So, from a personal eating perspective, knew it existed, but certainly not how impactful this industry is. And I, love working in it so much that I just wish I'd done it sooner.
Yeah, me too. I wish I had been an investor in this space much sooner. Okay, you're having a bad day. Not everything's going the way you would like. Is there a phrase that you say to yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
So this is a funny one. I've heard many answer this question, and I know a lot of it is about kind of productivity and staying motivated. But mine is that I'm a human being, not a human doing. And so for me, that's a reminder that I'm a person, not a machine, and need to meet a wide range of needs, not just maximize impact at every moment of every day. And of course, the hope is that by doing so, that remembering that I'm a whole being, not just, grading myself on what I've accomplished every day, that I can maximize that impact over the long term.
I love that. It riffs off a little bit of sometimes what I say to myself, which I've been saying a lot lately, is maybe you should just take a nap. And that has worked for me. And I love naps. Why did naps ever go away? Actually, nap time is really key. Okay. You're running around, very busy day. You don't have time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
Yeah, so this is a new one. It is lupini beans. Have you had those?
I know of them, and I've seen a lupini bar, but I haven't had the bean by itself.
Yeah, so it's this pickled bean snack. I think it's quite common in the Mediterranean. I will credit this to my colleague, Marika Azov, who is obsessed with them. And they are delicious. They're a great source of protein and fiber, really filling. And you can just kind of grab a handful, eat them, and ready to go.
How do I get my hands on them? I want to try them.
They're at Whole Foods.
Really? And what are they called again? Lupini beans?
Lupini beans, yeah.
Okay. Lupini beans. Okay. That's great. We all have our marching orders. Go to Whole Foods, get your lupini beans. And if you are a plant-based innovation company or a large meat and dairy company, this works for dairy as well as meat. Yes,
Yes.
yes. Any food company or any company that is producing food as part of one of its businesses, you can go to gfi.org/industry/ESG-reporting. It's going to be in the show notes. You're going to see it on LinkedIn. You're going to have access to it. You could probably just Google it as well to get this framework, which can really help you shape how you think and how you execute to get the data which you can report internally and externally to be able to show the powerful impact that you do to investors and the world. I am, of course, incredibly indebted to Sharyn Murray and the entire GFI team. How many people are at GFI now?
Over 180 globally.
Oh my God, the work you do, really just so grateful for all the work that you do. And of course, FAIR, Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return Initiative, doing incredible work there, headed up by Maria Latini, just a beautiful person working so hard. So Sharyn, please don't go away. You stay put. Everybody else on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. I will see you next week from San Francisco, Future Food Tech. It's happening next week and I will be there. I will see you everybody next week. Sharyn, stay put. Bye, everybody.